must be wondering, what am I doing? I know many of you out there saying respiring. There you go again, I caught you children. What did we discuss in the last episode? This is not respiration. What is it called as? Breathing. Hi friends, welcome back to the second episode on respiration. I want all of you to pull up yourself and recall what we studied in the last episode. In the last episode, we discussed how respiration is different from breathing. What are the different modes of respiration? That is aerobic and anaerobic respiration. We also learned that in spite of having different organs for respiration, the basic requirements or the basic features of all respiring surfaces happens to be the same. Today, in this episode, we would be discussing the different organs of respiration in fishes and in human beings. That is, we would be discussing about gills and lungs. So let us look at this. Look at what this fish is doing. Opening and closing its mouth. Also, opening and closing its gills. Can you see that the movement is coordinated? For what is it doing this act? As soon as the fish opens its mouth, water enters inside, carrying dissolved oxygen in it. And then it is taken to the gills, where the gills are richly supplied with blood capillaries, which are carrying deoxygenated blood from all parts of the body to the gills. Here, the capillaries take in oxygen from the water, and in this way they get oxygenated. Carefully notice another thing. The rate at which the fish is opening its mouth, isn't it very fast? Compare it with your rate of breathing, which is maximally 12 to 16 times per minute. Why does a fish breathe at such a fast rate? The reason is because oxygen dissolved in water is comparatively less. In the surface waters, there can be about 5 ml of oxygen per liter of water. This is much less than the 210 ml of oxygen per liter of air that we breathe. So the number of times it takes in water is large, so that more amount of oxygen dissolved in water is taken in just 1 minute. Well, that was all about a fish breathing, very much in brief. Let us now have an overview of the human respiratory system. Since the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide has to take place across the thin surface of alveoli in lungs, which is very fine and delicate, in order to protect this surface, it is usually placed within the body, and so there have to be passages that will take air to this area. The lungs are placed in the thoracic cavity, protected inside a rib cage. The lungs are covered by a double membrane called pleura. This double membrane is filled with the fluid called pleural fluid, which acts as a shock absorber and also protects the lungs from external shocks. And now, let us have a look at the passage of air into our lungs. The respiratory system starts with the two openings called as nostrils. There is a passage in the nose behind the nostrils, which is called as nasal cavity or the nasal passage. The air for respiration enters into our body through the nostril and then enters into the nasal cavity, which is lined with fine hair and mucus. When air passes through the nasal cavity, dust particles and other impurities get trapped by the nasal hair and mucus. from the nasal cavity, air enters into pharynx, and then it enters through the opening of the larynx called glottis and reaches the larynx, which is also called the sound box of human body. This larynx is placed just above the trachea. Air thus enters into the trachea. The trachea is a tube also known as windpipe. Trachea does not collapse even when there is no air in it because it is supported by cartilaginous rings. The trachea runs down the neck and divides into two smaller tubes called bronchi. The two bronchi are connected to the lungs. Each bronchi divides in the lungs to form a large number of small tubes called bronchioles. At the end of the bronchioles, tiny air sacs are present, known as alveoli, which are very thin-walled and surrounded by thin blood capillaries. There are 300 million alveoli in 2 adult lungs, which means it provides a surface area of 160 meters square, which, if I may say so, equals to that of a singles area of a tennis court, or maybe 80 times the area of our skin. So I hope now you children know how our alveoli and the lungs are efficiently designed for maximal exchange of gases. Now, having learnt the passage of air into the body, have you ever wondered how is it that air enters the body? Does something push it in, or do we pull it in? Let us have a look at the exact mechanism of breathing in man. Breathing consists of 2 phases, inspiration and expiration. During inspiration, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles contract. The diaphragm moves downward, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, and the intercostal muscles pull the ribs up, expanding the rib cage and further increasing this volume. This increase of volume lowers the air pressure in the alveoli to below atmospheric pressure. Because air flows from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure, it rushes in through the respiratory tract and into the alveoli. In contrast to inspiration, during expiration, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles relax. This returns the thoracic cavity to its original volume, increasing the air pressure in the lungs and thus forcing the air out. Well, the air has been taken in, but what about its exchange and transport to other parts of the body? How does it enter the blood, and in what form is it transported in the blood? Let us now have a look at that. Once having entered the alveoli, which is richly supplied with capillary network carrying deoxygenated blood, the oxygen simply diffuses across the alveolar membrane into the capillary. Since the alveoli is carrying oxygen, which is at a higher partial pressure, it simply diffuses across the membrane of the alveoli into the capillary network, which is deoxygenated, that is, it has oxygen at a low partial pressure. Blood consists of the respiratory pigment called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is found inside the red blood corpuscles or the RBCs. As soon as oxygen enters inside the blood, 97% of the oxygen combines with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin and gets transported in that form. Hemoglobin, do remember, has very high affinity for oxygen. The remaining 3% gets dissolved in the plasma and is transported also in the dissolved form. As soon as the blood reaches the tissues, the oxygen is given to the tissues which are badly in need of it. Here again, it is the partial pressure which is involved for the diffusion of gases. In the blood, the partial pressure of oxygen is very high, and that in the tissues is very low. So, oxygen from the blood diffuses into the tissues. Exactly the opposite process is happening for carbon dioxide. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissues is very high because the cells are metabolizing, whereas the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is low. And so carbon dioxide moves from the tissues into the blood. Now, because carbon dioxide is more soluble in water as compared to that of oxygen, it dissolves in the blood in the form of sodium bicarbonate and gets transported to the lungs. Here again in the lungs, it is again the partial pressure which is involved in the diffusion of carbon dioxide into the lungs. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood now is high, and that in the alveoli in the lungs is low. And so, carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the alveoli of the lungs. After the exchange of gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs, the whole process of transport starts again. Well, that was all for the process of breathing in case of human beings. Let me deviate from the topic a little and tell you something more about respiration. Isn't it so astonishing how different organs of our body are so intricately synchronized in their functioning? Ever wondered why is it that our heart rate and breathing rate suddenly increases when we start exercising? Let us learn something more about this. Our bodies burn fuel much like a car does. When you press on the gas, more fuel and air is sucked into the engine and combusted to produce more horsepower. When you exercise, your muscles act like electric motors. Just like an electric motor utilizes electricity to supply its energy, your muscles, which act as biochemical motors, actually utilize a chemical called adenosine triphosphate or ATP for their source of energy. But do remember, this ATP is actually produced in the muscles only when oxygen is supplied to it to break down sugar. These muscles also produce other metabolic waste products like carbon dioxide, which needs to be eliminated out of the body. Like an electric motor, it also generates a lot of heat. And all this is accomplished by the synchronized functioning of various organs of your body like heart, lungs, liver, etc. And now let us see how the increased rate of breathing is actually brought about in your body. The rate and depth of your breathing increases because of these events. Sympathetic nerves stimulate the respiratory muscles to increase the rate of breathing. Metabolic byproducts from muscles like lactic acid, hydrogen ions or carbon dioxide in the blood stimulate the respiratory centers in the brainstem, which in turn further stimulate the respiratory muscles. Slightly higher blood pressure caused by the increased force of each heartbeat and by the elevated cardiac output opens blood flow to more air sacs or the alveoli in the lungs. This also increases the ventilation and allows more oxygen to enter the blood. As the lungs absorb more oxygen and the blood flow to the muscle increases, your muscles have more oxygen. So now you know, children, to meet the demands of a working muscle, your body shows an orchestrated response involving various organs like lungs, liver, heart, skin, blood vessels and the nervous system. It is really an amazing system. So before we end, as per our custom, take a deep breath and start recapitulating. We learnt basically the mechanism of respiration in fishes. We also learnt the mechanism of breathing in case of human beings. So all you children out there, as per our custom, do this breathing exercise. 1, 2, 3. You know what? We all are increasing our lung capacity. And greater the lung capacity, greater the oxygen which is supplied to all the tissues of your body. You know what? Mountaineers and athletes have a higher lung capacity. That's because they exercise regularly. So don't forget to do our customary breathing exercise whenever you read respiration.